Another idea, a preference
Preference for what?
for a different structure. I'm laying out the structure.
I see, I see. Okay, no, this is all good.
Okay, so I'll start. Um, so we'll start with section 30, and you can follow along if you'd like. I'll give you the page numbers as I mark out the quotes. So the title of section 30 is The Transcendental Ego Inseparable from the Erlebnissen, the lived experiences making up their life. The transcendental ego is not able to be separated from lived experiences. How are we to recognize it then? And if we recognize it, how are we to describe it? How does it come to givenness such that it becomes a theme or even an object of consciousness? These are the, quote, constitutional problems that we face with Husserl. Objects claim to be, sind für mich, are for me, only by being related to consciousness. But what does this being for me mean? The meaning of their being for me is, this is on page 65, quote, constitutional investigation. And this investigation occurs by only, again a quote, one possible method, the one demanded by the essence, Wesen, of intentionality. 65. That method, that essence, is one of describing and remaining within the interplay of subject and object. The objects that I experience are for me. They appear only in connection to me. And yet I also only appear in relation to them. So this is page 65, it's a quote. The transcendental ego is what it is solely in relation, Bezug, to intentional objectivities. So I'm going to argue that the ego is not just appear in relation or is in relation. I'm going to say the ego is relation or reference. It is not a thing or a noun. It is relation. As relational, the ego, though, has, quote, again 65, systems of intentionality. There is not one relation and then another. There are systems of internal relations to lived experiences. And there are systems of external relations to the objects of which experience presents itself. To some degree, then, these systems of relations of ego to intentional objects are, quote, again, still on 65, going on within. But to some degree, these relations are, quote, partly as fixed potentialities, which, thanks to pre-delineating vorzeichnende horizons, are available for uncovering, Enthüllung. So I'm going to focus on that notion of uncovering. Phenomenology is thus always hermeneutic. There are threads between ego and objects, between ego and itself, between ego and systems of relations. The ego is situated by means of things and their own relations to entire orders. The thing is situated by means of the ego and its experience of the thing, an experience which can always open onto the references that the thing carries within it without necessarily manifesting explicitly. The thing, Husserl says, again on page 65, quote, indicates, indisiert, its correlative system. This particular discussion of this particular section of Husserl indicates an unfolding into the whole text, into phenomenology, philosophy, pedagogy, etc. How does a thing indicate a whole system? It indicates all the sets of relations that are implicit in its appearance, in its being for me, because it appears as a correlate of that system. It can only appear or claim being, and this is where Husserl says it explicitly on page 65, quote, as itself the correlate of its system. We are reading this book because it appears as a seminal text in a phenomenological movement. It appears as embedded within Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Hegel, Kant, Descartes, etc. Its rays, the rays of this text, backwards and forwards, are what allow it to manifest itself as such. Things are never self-appearances only. They are appearances of regions, of systems of relations. They are historical and anticipatory resonances. This is what the meaning of the thing's appearance for me as being means. Being is undiscovered meaning that can be uncovered. Now I'm going to go on to section 31, again through 33. So the title of 31 is The Ego as Identical Pole of Lived Experiences. Subjective processes, just again, names Erlebnisse. But the ego appears to itself. It does not appear as particularly needy or dependent. It appears as powerful. This is page 66. Quote, the ego is itself existent, Ziendas, for itself in continuous evidence. Thus, in itself, the ego is continuously constituting itself as existing. I'm saying it's powerful because it's constituting itself. It's building itself up. It's appearing on behalf of itself. We recognize ourselves as such. I appear before and to myself as having a life, as already started, as unable to be frozen in time. This pushing myself out of myself appears as a self-birth. But we are also apparent to ourselves not just as temporal, but as self-identical. This is page 66. Quote, not only as a flowing life, but also as I being the self-identity. So how are we to account for this identity that presents itself on its own as a flow? The I is intentionally conceived as a pole, P-O-L-E, as intertwined with objects. But there would be no identity, no way to maintain the ability of the ego to appear to itself if there were not, page 66, quote, a second polarization, a second kind of synthesis. We are not simply entwined with objects, we are entwined with our experiences, our cogitationes. If the ego of the first synthesis belongs to the system of objects in order to have a recognizable system of intentionality, then in this second sense, the system of experiences belongs to the ego who, quote, lives in all processes of consciousness and is related through them to all object poles. That's on page 66. So two syntheses, which are always already happening, are always already functioning. The object pole corresponds to the ego pole, and the ego pole corresponds to the multiplicity of its own experiences. So there are two kinds of active synthesis that are making the ego be what it is, flowing towards the objects and rooted in itself. The I is a life. And whenever Husserl says ego, he just says ich. It's the I. The I is a life. It is a life within each experience and across all experiences. It is a self-presenting sameness across and by means of the diversity of its experiences. By means of the power it has in its sameness, of living into and across its particular experiences, it can relate or refer or be referred to the objects of those experiences. Because I live in my experiences, I live also in or toward the objects, and they live in or toward me and one another. This is section 32, the ego as substrate of habitualities. The ego as a center of relation is, page 66, quote, not an empty pole, P-O-L-E. This means that no I is a simple I. We are not within mere identity, as it were. Instead, with every intentional act, the I, quote, acquires a new abiding property. Page 66. This is important. There was never a time when the I was or is empty. It was always already acting, always already in the process of acquiring habits or properties. The I is always already acquiring determinacy by means of its relations with objects. Its development occurs by means of its relations. To make an act of judgment is to commit oneself toward being, quote, the ego who is thus and so decided. I can say this webinar is a lot of fun and make a judgment to myself. Even if I give up this judgment or decision or action, it's now boring. I don't like it anymore, or whatever. I'm tired of hearing Peter read his material. Still, the previous judgment, that it was fun, has determined and continues to determine the identity of my ego. I am the ego who once had judged or decided in this way, but now has given it up. The gathering of determinacy into myself that I do by means of my intentional acts is not merely an act of memory. That is, the quote-unquote abiding property is not the expression of my being able to, quote, remember the act. Rather, the act becomes part of my givenness. It's almost like like if you're watching a stream and you drop some dirt into the stream, you can see it settle into the bed of the stream. This is what's happening sort of metaphorically with judgments that I make or experiences that I have. They settle into the stream and they determine what I am as given to myself. I am given to myself as thus propertied and can, this is page 67, quote, find myself as the ego who is convinced, who as the persisting ego is determined by this abiding habitus or state. To find myself is to be given to myself as determined. It is to have myself on hand. In whatever I do, judge, perceive, the very definition of the I is changed because each intentional act is on the way to a habit. What an abiding habit or property means is that the I acquires depth and meaning in its core or pole. It is, again, this will be on 67 through the end of this, a peculiar change that the ego undergoes in respect of them, the properties. This change is not simply the filling up of a void. These abiding properties are, quote, not a continuing filling of immanent time with experiences or subjective processes. The I is not an empty stream that experiences then go fill up with color or shape or form. The I is itself changed. The I, quote, is not a process or a continuity of processes. Either of these metaphors, experiences as filling immanent time, or the acts of the I as filling the I up as a network of experiences, misses the very existential situation. I exist as these abiding properties that I get because of my experiences. What it means to be this I changes because the positions I take, the intentional acts that I adopt, matter to me. Maybe I could play with words and say, or perhaps these positions and acts are my matter. The I as, quote, identical substrate always already is in the process of becoming, quote, a fixed and abiding personal ego. The transcendental ego is always already also concrete, also becoming Sarah or Muhammad or me. The mere identity of the I is always already accruing, quote, an abiding style with a unity of identity throughout all of them, a personal character. End quote. To be an I, then, is to be both one of the centers of the ellipse of consciousness, subject and object within the same form, and also a developing person who becomes both what she or he sees and the how or in the manner in which he or she sees. So this will be then section 33. It's a little bit longer, but then we'll break for some questions. So the title of section 33 is The Full Concretion of the Ego as Monad and the Problem of its Self-Constitution. So if you look on page 67, under 33, there's a quote I'll begin with. Ego as identical pole and as substrate of habitualities can be distinguished from, quote, the ego taken in full concreteness, or the monad. While in terms of time, the pole that the ego is and the person are always together, we as phenomenologists can distinguish the mere flow and action of self-synthesis, the mere identity and substrate, from the developing person. The concreteness of the monad is the very togetherness of subject and object in consciousness. This is on page 68. Quote, the ego can be concrete only in the flowing multiformity of its intentional life, along with the objects meant. The very insight into the monad as both me and my acts and my objects and how they become a person, the very insight into the monad changes us. We attend to the along with of the objects and acts. And then we see there is no determination of what or who we are that is not directly related to the objects of which we are conscious. As a matter of fact, the very claim to being that an object makes on us is itself what arises insofar as its connection to our habit is made clear. This is a longer quote on page 68. Manifestly, in the case of an object so constituted, its abiding existence and being thus are a correlate of the habitually constituted in the ego pole himself by virtue of position taking. I have come to understand this book of Husserl's, and indeed all 3 volumes of what he had titled The Ideas, as making a point about the very life of things as given within our perception of them. I cannot see otherwise than how I perceive Husserl's arguments appearing within them. So these books are constituted, for me, as announcing the connection of subject and object, and their claim to this interpretation is inseparable now from my position that I take in reading them. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this as an example of how what I am as an I is inseparable from the way that I perceive the things that are in my experience. Here's another example. I am tending to the daffodils outside our home. When I wrote this, they were yellow and alive. Now they're all dead. Sad. Just so you know, updated version. Daffodils are all gone. When I wrote this example, however, they announced themselves as the reappearance of themselves from the previous years. They announced themselves as the same flowers that my father planted for us here in these garden beds before he died. The appearance of the flowers as first a reappearance and then a reappearance of my father's acts are inseparable from the habit of mine of connecting them in that way. Like to somebody else who doesn't live here, they're not going to connect it to my dad, right? Their value, their being for me in this significant way, is in fact the habit I have of receiving them or constituting them in this way. Husserl speaks in this way about how I am acquainted or how I become acquainted with my surrounding world and the objects that appear within it. He says that, quote, page 68, in my synthetic activity, the object becomes constituted originally, perceptively, as identical to itself. I am the site, S-I-T-E, of hermeneutics. I am where the happening of the object and the happening of myself connect and reinforce one another. This is another quote from page 68. My activity of positing and explicating being sets up a habituality of my ego, by virtue of which the object is mine abidingly. End quote. The object's claim to being, its continuous appeal to me as recurring as itself, roots itself in my habit. It is not that I create the object, nor is it that the object creates me as a habit of belief or perception. Rather, we participate in the upsurge of each into the other. I am the perception of the same daffodils and of my Father, because they announce themselves to me. These daffodils announce because I have already received and invited them to make their claims, because I hold on to their claims as mattering to me. And this intertwining of habit and appearance, subject and object, extends beyond what is immediately at hand. By means of this or that experience, I am put in relation, this is again on page 68, to, quote, horizons of objects with which I am unacquainted. I am not just a concrete monad. I'm not just this person with this particular history and this particular house and these particular daffodils. Right? I am a substrate and unity. That means I am always already able to move beyond the concrete toward the world, toward the remaining, toward the implicit, towards the a priori, towards the next. To have each experienced object embedded within me as a habit is to have its unacquired sides or references to other things within me as my potential acts. So that's the import of the noetic-noematic correlation. Objects in their claim to being are the solicitation, the invitation to more meaning that connects to them by means of their horizon. What I am then, by means of these objects and their unexplored references that are nevertheless within me by virtue of my position on what I do notice, what I am in that situation is, page 68, quote, continually given to myself. And that means that I'm not continually self-transparent and I'm not continually aware of myself as producing myself. The object, the horizon, is never fully given to me. Thus, I am always open to more projects, more experiences of it. I am never fully given to myself either. If I were fully self-given, I would not be open to the horizon, to the objects yet to come, to the sides not yet seen. If the object were fully given, I would have no motivation or connection to what was to come. I include myself as, quote, the whole of actual and potential conscious life. That's page 68. That is why I develop and why development matters to me and is never complete, never total. The whole of me is given to myself, but given as a whole that is always yet to be made adequate to my having of it. To describe what and who I am phenomenologically is to engage in phenomenology as a whole. It is to see implicated in my own structure and my occlusion, my concealment from myself, the very space and intertwining of things. To see the difference or distinction between I as substrate and I as monad is to see the world as the space or the thing that unites those, substrate and monad, together. Okay, so that's what I was thinking about in sections 30 to 33. We can stop for a little bit and maybe see if there are any questions or disputes notes or anything else before we move on to Christos? Did I bore everyone?
Well, Olga has something. No, I had a question, but go ahead, Olga.
No, Christos, you go ahead. You were first. You want to
Sure. Yeah.
ask your question.
Yeah. So, well, actually, I want to also thank you because I really struggled with these first four sections. So I'm very thankful that you took them on. I got sort of three questions. One is this kind of juxtaposition of the flowing and the fixed, and the flowing aspect of the ego and the fixed aspect of the ego as the objects being constituted. And I was just trying to understand to what extent he I mean, is he sort of suggesting that as the ego, is there like a primary ego and a secondary ego, and the primary flowing ego creates these fixed objects which it intends, and in that sense, are these objects do these objects remain as part of the ego in this kind of network of objects as you were kind of describing? I'm not sure if I have it right. I mean, is there something more than be helpful to kind of understand this kind of is this like a mother and child, but the child never lets go of the mother, or I was just not too sure. Yeah,
Was that all of the questions that you had, or did you have more?
got more. I just didn't want to kind of overload. Yeah. Do you want me to ask the rest as well?
Um, Maybe let's go one at a time because they're really rich and interesting. And you're right. I'm not sure that I wouldn't be overloaded with all the things that you're thinking about so clearly and well. Um, so I like how you put that it's both flowing and fixed, and that in some ways the difference between those is the difference between substrate and monad. Um, the substrate sort of being the fixed parts of the systematic structures, and the flowing part being the monad, which is historical. Um, I think that gets to how difficult it is for Husserl to describe the ego, the transcendental ego, as both of these things. It is not just action, so it's not just a verb, and it's not really a noun. It's not really a thing, except if we were to take what our ordinary lived experience of our life is. Like if we just look and we sometimes we reflect on our lives, right? And we think, oh, I have a good life, or I don't have a very good life, or I have a really um, rich social life, or I'm very insulated. I have a very poor social life. Like we have a sense for what our life is, and yet like where is that? What is that? How do you point to that particular kind of thing? I think the difficulty in pointing to what the transcendental ego is at all comes up in these sections and throughout, I think, Husserl's descriptions. And then the connection between both the substrate and the monad, or between the transcendental ego and the personal ego. Like this is really hard to figure out. I think your metaphor of a parent and a child, but a child who doesn't leave. Like I have a friend who's, I don't know, 63. He lives with his parents still in Italy. Like, and not just because he can't afford to move out, but like that's just what he's doing, right? And so I know deeply what that particular structure might look like in one of its forms. I don't think that the substrate or the transcendental ego is the parent, but I also think that, as we're going to see in some of your sections, I think in 38, where the infant has to learn how to see perceptual things. I think there is a way in which, without the substrate, the person that I am as this concrete personal ego could not develop. And so I don't know more about what to say to that, but I think you're raising the really important question of whether these are two or one. And
Hear me, I just need to this
yeah,
phone, sorry.
yeah. While Christos is attending to someone or something, anybody want to say something else?
Yeah. Just wanted to, I meant the mother as the, sorry, I don't know why they were ringing, the mic ring, but the mother as the monad, of course, monad taken in a very kind of particular way, not necessarily in the Leibnizian or the Neoplatonic kind of sense. But although it might also, I mean, I don't know the level of flexibility of articulation, I mean, of the one, but no, I meant like the flowing is the mother, like the continuum is the mother of the discrete and the objects and the kind of net and the network of sense, if that makes sense of sort of I don't know if
Well,
that helps.
do you want to say more about that relationship for you and hazard an interpretation then? Like what is it going to mean if one is the parent and one the child?
Um, I mean, in a small way, perhaps to follow the Taoist, one is greater than the other. I mean, we're not talking about grown-up kids, we're talking about something that's kind of sort of smaller, in a kind of in its sense as a as a as a fashion. I mean, to what extent it can outgrow uh, the make a bit like an AI, perhaps, could be debatable. But I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that one cannot support living just by this kind of the fixed and abiding substrate of the personal ego, right? That one has to have some profundity or some depth or something that kind of moves one. And yeah, I'm just not quite sure on because they're kind of such different aspects or different qualities. I'm just not quite sure how they arise, like how one arises out of the other, how they retain their, if you'd like, ego qualities. That might kind of refer a little bit to my second question. I was just thinking on the Kantian kind of perhaps roots on at the end of 31, the objects and points and setting unities. I was just thinking about, to what extent it might echo a little bit the Kantian analytic and synthetic unity of parts with parts and part with, but again, I wasn't too sure. Anyway, I found it. I didn't flow with it as I I was before and after. So I think there was something about these chapters that was difficult for me. So yeah.
Well, that's helpful. I don't know enough or I don't remember enough about Kant to be able to specify that. What I can say is that I don't think I think the distinctiveness of the transcendental ego or of the, the substrate versus the monad, I think they're distinct only in phenomenological reflection. That is, you wouldn't find the transcendental ego without the epoche and without the reduction. So I think it's by means of that specific kind of reflection that we get into the structures that he might be talking about in your sections and later of pre-givenness, that we are operating with systems of experiential laws or experiential
Mm,
essences that we cannot see or account for when we are simply living our concrete lives. But
mm,
those concrete lives bear within them this transcendental ego as both mine and distinct. So, I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question. I think you're asking the exact right question. I'm not sure how to answer it, But for me, the thread is it isn't a thing. Um, and by not being a thing or not simply being a verb, by being pre-givenness without that pre-givenness ever being clear or given to me as clear, then I just live their distinction as meaningful. Um, the transcendental ego must always be accessible to a phenomenologist within the concrete experiences that they're having. But the fact that it's accessible doesn't mean that it dissolves into it either. Um,
Mm. That's very helpful, actually, because as you were saying it, I was thinking about the artificial process, say, of something like plasmapheresis or something like, that you would remove the particulate, and then you would be left with something that appears to be more fluid, but it's not in its nature to be without, but it's something that we do so that we can have some sort of experience of it without the objects themselves, if that makes sense. If I got
that's
it right, what you
excellent.
were
Yeah,
saying.
no, I think that's exactly right. That's good.
Mm.
It's very helpful. Olga, you wanted to say something?
I'm afraid that I'll hijack you because there are so many metaphysical or ontological questions here about the style of thinking and how it relates to existentially to a person. So I think that I should not.
Not even for thinking about and talking about later? Like, in other words, you can mention them and we can move on, or you can hold on to them.
There is a conflict. I don't know, it may be related to what Christos was talking about, but there is a conflict between um, systems which infer the ego out of complete reduction to the ego pole. Um, yeah, in that sense, Descartes didn't finish the doubt because the doubt can continue, right? So, in this vision of the living subjectivity as constituted and intentional. So, and this opens if we start going into it, this opens the whole can of worms. Um, because well, the idea of intentionality, it comes from a mathematical system, from morphology, again, going into science. So there will be intentional relationship are mathematically described. So I don't know who it was first who borrowed this idea, whether Brentano or people earlier, but it's a formal thing related to abstract objects. And then, then we take this formal abstract concept, right? It's applied to living system. And then, so what's the validity of this transfer? Can we use it to distinguish between living and non-living systems? That's especially important for artificial intelligence studies, etc. So I was going in this direction, but again, I that's a long discussion. That's speculative, and I don't know if we should.
Okay. So why don't we think about it and we can return to it? But I'm glad that you mentioned all the things that you're thinking.
Honestly, that I stopped it.
No, no, I just don't know. I myself don't know how to respond to those things. I'll say one quick thing and then see if anyone else has thoughts on any of the sections before we go over to Christos. Um, I think this is Husserl's attempt to describe the living system of consciousness. So whether it can be applied to non-living systems, I don't know. I'm not sure that that matters so much if it adequately describes the the way in which consciousness develops its life. If it is, I hadn't thought about this, nor did I know it, but if it is taken from abstraction, and it would seem like that's how Husserl begins. I think the interesting question that you're raising, in addition to whether it can be for non-living things, is whether we do enough justice to concrete experiences of particular things by means of the essential structures, for example, of noesis and noema, the intertwining.
Yeah, it's the whole, relationship of formalization in life.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on 30 to 33 before we turn it over to Christos? Or questions? And if you have, like, Sarah,
I,
you haven't been here before, but you're certainly welcome to say anything you would like.
Peter, can we pull in Mohammed on the topic of life and non-life in terms
Sure.
of intentionality?
In what ways?
What do you think? You work with computer intentionality all the time. So not in terms of self-awareness, but in terms of the, let's say, properties of that intelligence. Is it comparable with the transcendental ego, as Peter just described it?
I think the one thing that was mentioned, Peter mentioned, was very interesting is this he defined the transcendental ego as relation. And so I think in that relation, for example, you can think of the computer can learn and interact with its environment. And in that relation, at least a probabilistic program or probabilistic information expansion it's formed. So I think there is an interesting correlation. Yeah, so I think there's an interesting correlation in that notion of relation.
Okay, well, thank you. So, Peter, I just make one more step and then stop. So, from Mohammed's response and how I see it too, it seems that we cannot distinguish between life and non-life based on the concept of the transcendental ego in Husserl. That the way it's framed, the way it's worded in chapter 4, in section 4, it doesn't give us option of discriminating. It doesn't have capacity to inspire discrimination between life and non-life. Like we can apply this description to living ego, to the living present in the future, right? Or we can apply it to artificial intelligence, and the concept will still work. So we have to look then for other ways of distinguish between computer intelligence and human.
So if I were to add one more thing, so for me, still perhaps the one distinguishing factor is the will to relate, is that locus of that will. Because it's one thing to define the ego as the relation, the other thing is that there is that desire, there's that will to form that relation or to. So I think that question of will, I think, becomes of importance.
It's very interesting what you're suggesting to me. What do you think, Peter? Yes.
Well, the problem with this particular meditation wasn't, I didn't think, that you couldn't distinguish life from non-life or machine from person, although certainly that is in Descartes' meditations, perhaps within the fourth one, where he is talking about how if he goes up high into the cathedral and looks down on the square, he doesn't know that they are people. They could be, what was the word for robots then?
Automata.
Automata, yes, they could be those. And so that occurs in the meditations, and so it's right to ask the question. I think everything depends on Christos's initial question about whether these are two or one and how they're connected, namely the substrate and the monad, or between the flowing and the fixed character of the ego in its different forms. But also, Husserl is talking about lived experiences. It's always about life all the way through. Your comment is really interesting because I don't believe will or desire comes up in this at all. Like in this fourth meditation, for sure, I don't think it comes up, which is not to say that you're wrong. It's just to say I don't know what to make of that now that I think about it, now that you brought that up. But I think if the ego is always issuing into a habituality, right, into a quality of a life that is then given to itself as having this history, then it's sort of like gathering layers as it works. It is as substrate also immediately concrete. It is a life that opens from eidetic a priori into concrete a posteriori all the time. And it has never been simply one or the other. And so I guess what I'm saying is it seems to me that what Husserl is trying to describe is simply this process of living consciousness as interacting with a living life world. And so there really isn't anything else but that he's describing. What that means for AI, I don't know. I'm not able to say. But I don't get the feeling that he is invoking, and maybe he should be, he's not invoking will or desire at this point. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking of. I'm not sure that it answers to anything Muhammad or Christos or you have said, but
Can I just say that that's like a beginning of trouble? I have to say a little bit more here now. So I had a teacher of Vedanta, and he used to say that unless one discovers this substrate within the ego itself, which is not in the object, but prior to the object, ontologically prior in the ego, unless one discovers that, then one is a victim of every passing bug. Because there is, well, how do we distinguish then? What are the boundaries of individuality if we are so deconstructed into the flow of experiences, which is basically defined by the external environment? So is there any possibility of an immortal soul in me, or even of the Buddhist natural mind? Is there anything innately stable that pertains to me as an individual?
So, Sally, it looks like you have something to say.
Just very quick, my impression is that he's boiled this down to its bare bones, and then therefore he's not even getting into how, well, as we go through our lives, I mean, we're constantly filtering out experiences that we could have, because it's like, or you know, and yet on the other hand, multitasking definitionally implies the fact that we are capable of managing multiple experiences simultaneously. So I don't know if that's a digression. But I just wanted to also say, it's Stein, Edith Stein said that, you know, put the centerpiece on empathy. And that, in that regard, I have this idea that empathy makes us almost move into the object of our experience, and you know, and like we give ourselves to it in a weird kind of a way. We're reaching out and grasping that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Mhm. That's really helpful, especially as we approach the fifth meditation, to remember that. I think that's really important. And Muhammad, I think as I'm rehearsing what I said to you, I think I'm not quite right. I think perhaps this leaving behind the realm of causality for the realm of motivation is, in a way, taking up will and desire, although not stated directly. nevertheless, that's where like my particular layering of the daffodils in my dad, that's sort of a motivated set of experiences. So maybe there is that happening here too. So that's just me reflecting.
Hmm.
I just
Shall
want
we?
to say this to maybe because unless this question of will is not really, I think for me, is not well spelled out, it almost sounds like the computer doesn't really have a will as long as it's connected to the power and the program is running, and then it's running in this relation and it's sort of expanding the state. Let's call it that live experience. And we just assume a very mechanical way is connected to the wall and the current is going through, and as long as the current is going through, it doesn't have any ontological status, it doesn't have any perhaps importance, but then it just becomes the necessary means to allow that that relation or that experience to or that becoming to keep sort of expanding.
I guess if the experience has a center, right, and has a center as a substrate that gathers habits, right, then the distinguishing AI from a human being is going to be very difficult, as Olga said, in this particular context. The gathering of habits by means of the central activity of the substrate seems to be what is Husserl's definition for an experiencer. And it follows out motivations. It does not follow out natural scientific causality. Welcome to Marvin. Glad to see you. Marvin, you know just about everybody. Sarah is here for the first time. She was a student of mine in phenomenology. She's going on to get her master's and PhD in education and philosophy. And Miyuki is joining us from Japan. Hello. Shall we turn it over to Christos now?
Can I take a tiny stab before we go forward?
Absolutely. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I'm brand new and I feel like I'm like an elementary kid in like a college class, but I'm gonna try. Peter knows this about me, but I love Kierkegaard. And so when you guys were talking about, I was really interested in the actuality versus potentiality. I think the terms you were using was monad and substrate. I thought of anxiety rather than the will as kind of that exists, what exists between the two, and maybe a differentiator of humanity, kind of along the lines of what you're saying. And I have no idea if that's like relatable to what you guys were saying, but I think maybe. But I think when I think of that actuality versus potentiality, and that's a very human thing, is there's angst there between like what's next, what's I'm constantly developing, which is lovely, but whew, that's also anxiety. Like there's all these different pathways and potentialities. So that's one thing I was thinking. Then the other thing that really caught me was the first comment that you said, Christos, where you're talking about fixed versus flowing. There was one quote that you read, Peter, on 68 that said, the ego can be concrete. And just like I stopped there, and that was really fascinating to me, thinking of something I often think of as the opposite of concrete, becoming concrete. And I thought, well, why does it need to become concrete? Does it actually become concrete? And then later you used concrete again when you were saying there's a place where we move beyond the concrete to the world through our experience, through our relationship. So I just thought that was like a super interesting juxtaposition. So fixed, flowing, concrete, moving beyond concrete. So those are my little takeaways, I guess.
I think that was great. And I think that I hadn't connected the connection between potential and actual itself mattering to the human being emotively in terms of but I think that's right. Like we can't connect potentiality and actuality or the transcendental ego and the monad. We can't connect those without that very connection being something that we're taking a stand on or that we're receiving in a particular way or that manifests itself in a particular way. So to go along with Muhammad's discussion of will and desire, I think anxiety is a perfect way of understanding what it would mean for the interrelationship between the flowing and fixed to become real. That's good. Pistos, you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're on page 69, 34, a fundamental development of phenomenological method, transcendental analysis as eidetic. And he says that, you know, we've touched on the problems of phenomenological genesis. And by doing so, perhaps in the sense that, you know, when things come so much into themselves that they can turn into the opposites, he twists around and becomes genetic phenomenology. And this he takes to be the method of a genuine and pure internal psychology as its parallel. And he speaks about the method of eidetic description and empirical descriptions. And to me, from the etymology, eidos to sort of from seeing, and empirical sort of with going through. One might have a more kind of cataleptic and passive, more passive, but not necessarily passive. The other one, a more cumulative and active, more active perhaps. One against a system of phenomena, and one finding a stability through fluxing world. One closer to maybe a true being or true invariance, and another as a kind of reconstituted invariance or a method of tasting that which is beyond the appearance of phenomena as they recur like waves, and the resistance and friction of experience is felt. And then I'm going to skip a little bit because we don't have so much time. So in page 70, he speaks, we, so to speak, sort of, I think this is sort of middle of the second paragraph, just above 105. We, so to speak, shift the actual perception into the realm of non-actualities, the realm of the as-if, which supplies us with pure possibilities and a completely free imaginableness of fantasy. And here I wondered, is this being done arbitrarily or by participating truly in the possible aspect? Again, eidos is a sort of an aspect, the true actuality of being instead of its faint shadow as empiria, which is through experience in its kind of non-eidetic kind of aspect. And then thus removed from all factualness, it has become the pure eidos perception, whose ideal extension is made up of all ideally possible perceptions, as purely, I think, is fantasizable process. I think that might be missing an A or something. I don't know. And then, and in this sense, it speaks to something that I was also thinking of, sort of an immersion into actuality, a participation into the possibility of an aspect of a form of an eidos. And through this immersion and participation, one can have a taste and a knowing of all possibilities of its kind. And well, I wrote some more, but let's skip that for now. And so this is a process that by kind of dipping into something opens up a whole swathe of possibility of the, as he put it, the fantasizable or the ideally possible perceptions, right? So somehow you overcome, if you'd like, your clunky beingness and go into this sense where it's just the flowingness with the particular aspect. And in that particular aspect, then you're able to see all its possible, imaginable aspects by participating with it as something of
found out.
sorry, by participating with it as something of your own nature. And then in the following page, which is 71, he talks about the essential universality and the essential necessity. And every fact can be thought of merely as exemplifying a pure possibility. And this is, of course, a true idealist position where you have something which is quasi-tethered, perhaps quasi-flexible, that can create itself, that remains itself, say like a circular shape that can kind of be oval, that can kind of shift into other dimensions, that can be kind of deformed, but it retains its quality as form, and that one can taste that by entering its well, he calls it perceptual, but I'll come later. I think I had this kind of idea that it is reception more than perception. I don't know if that's something in the translation that to me seems reception would be a more appropriate sort of reception of this. But perhaps he has more of an active sense of this than I do. So. And then he talks about the variation, presenting in pure intuition the possibilities themselves as possibilities. Again, so that we're going back again and again through this kind of mode of experiencing, which is not really in the regular mode of experiencing as empiria or empirical, but which is a cumulative experience that is like. One comes to terms with something through time by knowing it in, touching the elephant exteriorly, but that one goes internally, interiorly, and one then is able to see the possibilities of one's own perception and fantasy to organize experience itself, and in this kind of eidetic sense. And as he says, it is prior to all concepts. So this is not something that is fixed in the sense that we understand concepts to be fixed. And I'll say a little bit more actually. The eidos itself is a beheld or beholdable universal, one that is purely unconditioned, according to its own intuitional sense, and universal, not conditioned by any fact, is prior to all concepts in the sense of verbal significations and so on and so on. And any concepts must be made to fit the eidos, because in order to perceive, and I would say definitely perceive in this sense, because one does have a sense of tool manipulation for concepts as for objects, which I don't think that necessarily is the case for the eidos. One then can only work with it within a kind of a wider frame of possible experience. And each singly, so we're still in 71, second paragraph. Each singly selected type is thus elevated from its milieu within the empirically factual transcendental ego into the pure eidetic sphere. With each eidetically pure type, I've skipped a bit, we find ourselves not indeed inside the de facto ego, but inside an eidos ego. And this is where my questions from before can we get, and yet, it is bound by form and not unformed or sensation. multiplicity sensibility. Further down towards the end, the last sentence, if we think of phenomenology developed as an intuitively a priori science purely according to the eidetic method, all its eidetic researches are nothing else but uncovering of the all-embracing eidos. Transcendental ego is such, which comprises all pure possibility variants of my de facto ego and this ego itself qua possibility. And if we think of eidos as a translation of aspect, so the all-embracing aspect, or the embracing of all aspects, so that one can inhabit the totality of one's potentiality and possibility, if that might be possible, I don't know, but that there's a real sense that, you know, if one can do that, then one can for sure transcend any kind of, I mean, to me, it sounds like, well, in fact, I wasn't sure if it was more shadow puppetry or more a step towards theosis, so I wasn't too sure. But in the next page, 72, again, eidetic phenomenology explores the all-embracing laws that prescribe for every factual statement about something transcendental, the possible sense, as opposed to the absurdity or inconsistency of that statement. And I said, yes, it is an abstraction of ampliation rather than apheresis. It is a question to follow the Greek god, which I quite like, dipole horos over penia, something that gives, that gushes out, that kind of brings us, that gives us, rather than something that collapses, that takes away, that reduces. So it's in fact the exact opposite of an aphoretic or reductive abstraction. It is an in way, which is an opening that allows us to partake and participate and taste and experience in this eidetic form the fullness of all its potentiality and possibility. Further down page 72, but above 35, I fantasy only myself as if I were otherwise. I do not fantasy others. In itself, then, the science of pure possibilities precedes the science of actualities and alone makes it possible as a science. And I've got a note here, as participating being rather than vicarious having. Again, this kind of thing of the concept, you know, when one can grasp, when one has a separation, if you would like, from an object as a subject, and then, you know, one can hold, manipulate, and move. One, as you were saying with the flowers, and you know, one is participating, is entering, is experiencing by being, not by having. And 35, excursus into eidetic internal psychology. Page 73, to the concrete transcendental ego. There corresponds then the human ego, concretely as the psyche taken purely in itself and as it is for itself, with the psychic pluralization. I, as pole of my habitualities, the properties comprised in my character. So, and to me, this is interesting because, you know, we were talking earlier as well about the concrete and the substrate and the twinning, if you would like, with the transcendental flowing ego. But here he kind of, and the concrete he also describes as a personal ego, right? So there's this kind of sense where one becomes one's objects or one's sequences of objects or one's habits or one's ways of being in the world, you know, which of course, as we know, is a tendency of all human beings, and at the same time is not a necessity, so that one can resist, if you would like, the fixating only insofar as the fixating is alien to oneself. Of course, if the fixating has been done by oneself and one has created one's objects spontaneously and created their relationship spontaneously, then one would have created, if you would like, a concrete self that's not fixed, but kind of quasi-fixed, but quasi-flexible, and is in direct relationship with oneself as flowing. So the transcendental ego at the end of the paragraph no longer has a horizon that could lead beyond the sphere of his transcendental being and thus relativize him. So this is what he was saying, that, you know, once you've kind of expanded sufficiently that you know, you're no longer in the position that the ego would be delimited, and therefore will have an otherness that could impinge and sort of affect, in that sense, its powers. And I wasn't sure if this was like a self with a capital S or an Atman or something like that, or more like an uber ego, sort of an absolute all ego of an all father, pater deus, you know, in the Proto-Indo-European tradition. So there's this kind of again, this kind of uncertainty here for me. Am I okay to carry on, Peter? Yeah. 36, the transcendental ego as the universe of possible forms of subjective process. The compossibility of subjective processes in coexistence or succession is subject to eidetic laws. And again, here he uses this phrase at the end of the page, systematic sequence of problems and investigations. So there's something here that you know, I think that you know, when there's a system, there's a sequence, there's some sort of judgment, perhaps, and some sort of well, for sure, some sort of separation if there's a sequence. And page 74, I was a bit puzzled by, you know, he switches here from all his eyes to a we. I don't know if that's just the translation in the second line. Only in the last decade has the system begun to make itself clear, above all because we have gained new ways of access to the specifically universal problems of the transcendental ego's constitution. That kind of really made me kind of think, you know, from a unitary ego that he has become multiple, and I wasn't too sure what was going on there. But then the rest of the bits are interesting. The universal a priori is an eidetic form which contains an infinity of forms. Okay, and this is like just reiterates this kind of idea of entering the aspect in all its possibilities in infinity, basically, and an infinity that's not a determinate, like, you know, I don't know, like states that are quantic, but an infinity that's kind of fully flexible and creates an open kind of experience. But in a unitarily possible ego, not all singly possible types are compossible, and not all compossible ones are compossible in just any order. I really like that, and I think indeed, I put here, indeed, arboreal category structures are, you know, there's a limited variance. So as Tracy knows that. So, for example, it might be difficult to I mean, perhaps you could be a caring murderer, or, you know, to be, you know, like certain characteristics are not compossible. For example, like a square circle. Of course, you know, we can frame the circle with a square, or the square with a circle, but the characteristics of, say, a square and a circle may not be compossible. And perhaps, for example, it might not be possible to be caring destroyer or something like that. So like that certain qualities don't sit well with others, whilst many do sit very well with others. And yeah, and as he says, not compossible and necessarily, but even if compossible, not necessarily in just any order. So I think that was quite good. And at the end of the page, he speaks about temporality that participates in the system of forms that belongs to the all-inclusive temporality, sort of participating through time united and not a space separated. So that there is some sort of unifying or never separated continuity that belongs to his temporality, which I think also Bergson speaks of to some extent. Then next page, 75, 37, time as the universal form of all ecological genesis. The eidetic laws of compossibility rules that govern simultaneous or successive existence and possible existence together in the fact are laws of causality in the maximally broad sense, laws for an if and then. Skip a bit. The universe of subjective processes, which are the really inherent consciousness constituents of the transcendental ego, is a universe of compossibilities only in the universal unity form of the flux, in which all particulars have their respective places as processes that flow within it. Another little skip. The products that are flowingly constituting the flux of such processes is what we're talking about. So yes, I would say, to what in form annuls not existence, but a possible existence, to turn around his own explanation within a frame of particular life. And I was a little bit unsure about the if and then, because, you know, we've already kind of, I mean, he already spoke about the unconditionality of the eidos, and yet he tries to introduce this kind of stepwise causal chain, which to me doesn't seem quite. I wonder whether it's something to do with symmetry or logos as in sort of ratio. I wasn't too sure. And at the end, it should now be added that the constitutive systems are systems actually actualizable by the ego. Yeah, and next page, 76. And they are themselves possible only within the frame of a genesis in conformity with laws. And this makes the concrete ego, the monad, possible as a unity, as having particular constituents. And then he talks about this synthetic style. And this is where I was asking also before about Kant, because you know, what is the quality of this synthesis? In what way? How do its constituents, as you were saying, particular constituents, are unified? And I wasn't sure under what principle, under what kind of oneness. Yeah, and continue to the next page, 77, and then 38, active and passive genesis. He inquires first about principles of constitutive genesis, and then he kind of looks at the kind of active, passive poles, and he talks about how things, so ego acts constitute new objects originally, and then these present themselves for consciousness as products. So, and again, as we as you described earlier, Peter, bye, Sarah. As you described earlier, Peter, we have here a creation of objects by the ego that, however, maybe from the one kind of ego, the fluxing ego, but somehow they're presenting themselves as products. In the description, I don't know if that's just the translation, as if they're as if they've not been constituted by the ego itself. So that, like they have this kind of surprising or outward looking quality, though, of course, how else did they get constituted except for by the ego itself? So page 78, we've only got a few pages left. Page 78, at 110, the paragraph. The higher forms of such activities of reason, in a specific sense, and correlatively, the higher forms of products of reason, all of which have the character of irreality, that of ideal objects, cannot be regarded forthwith as belonging to every concrete ego as such. And again, here we have this kind of dualism, the real and the irreal ideal object, the eidos, the realm of the possible. And as he said, anything built by activity necessarily presupposes as the lowest level of passivity that gives something beforehand. And when we trace anything built actively, we run into constitution by passive generation. So, and again, this is how he tries to explain this kind of givenness of objects, which the ego, is constituting by twinning, if you would like, the activity passivity with this. And just for us, as at the end of that paragraph, as such a thing, it is given beforehand to spiritual activities, which begin with active grasping. I don't know if spiritual activities begin with active grasping, but I just thought to touch on it since it's a SoPheRE seminar. And then next, page 79, another interesting thing from middle of, it's all just one paragraph, but in early infancy, the field of perception that gives beforehand does not as yet contain anything that in a mere look might be explicated as a physical thing. So I think he's talking about this trope, which is, I think, also in psychological kind of text, where as a child, we have a flux of experience, and it's only with time that we increasingly concretize objects and put them into kind of semantic webs and create a substrate ego, perhaps. And further down, eidetic laws governing a passive forming of perpetually new synthesis, as we explained earlier, or as he explained earlier, that there's a formation, but that formation is experienced as passive from the point of view of an active bound ego. I don't know if that kind of further splits the ego or it's just a twinning. I wasn't too sure. So even at the end, even the circumstance that everything affecting me as a developed ego is perceived as an object, a substrate of predicates with which I may become acquainted, belongs here, since this is an already familiar goal form going on to page 80. for possible explications as acquaintative explications that will constitute an object as an abiding possession, as something accessible again and again. Then this goal form is understandable in advance as having arisen from a genesis. It itself points back to a primal instituting of this form. Everything known to us points to an original becoming acquainted. What we call unknown has nevertheless a known structural form, the form object, and more particularly the form spatial thing, cultural object, tool, and so forth. And yeah, so this is just but one type of unknown, but yeah. Am I doing 39 or am I done?
No, I think Marvin is going to do 39 to 41.
Okay, thank you. I hope it wasn't too bitty, but I just went through my reading of it and tried to highlight those aspects that felt important to me. And, you know, particularly the eidos and experience kind of twinning, and then also the active-passive aspect, which wasn't as clear, but yeah.
Thank you very much. So before we talk about your sections, and I want to do that, Marvin, how long would you need for your presentation?
Um, I don't know. It depends how focused I am, I guess. But probably at least 15 minutes, I would guess. And it's nice to leave some time for discussion also.
Would you be okay to do that next week?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay. So what I propose is we talk with Christos about the sections that he kindly read his reading of, and that if we have time, I'll go through some of the things that I thought about those. And then next week, we will start with, I may not get through all of mine, so maybe we'll start there. Then we'll do Marvin's presentation. We'll talk with Marvin. Then we'll finish the fourth meditation and go on to the fifth. I know that Miyuki has not had an opportunity to do a presentation, which she should certainly do if she wants. I think Muhammad has not done one. You should also feel free to do one. Again, there's no pressure to either of you, but I'm just giving you the option. But let's talk about 34 to 38 and direct your questions to Christos if you want, or to each other. What did you find? Marvin, go ahead.
I'm still understanding this material, but to me, it seems like it's something of a stretch to go for a like kind of a pure idealist concept. I think it's called the eidos, which is kind of discursive or cognitive in the sense of concepts. Preconceptual is probably a better term. So the eidos is defined here, I believe, as the set of all possible attributes, and it sounds very mystical in a way, and to me at least, and the set of all possibilities, I don't know if I've ever met. So it seems at best quite hypothetical. And in fact, in the later section, which you just covered, Christos, he kind of admits that different people will, like in the case of rationality, that contacting something that is expressed as rational is only available to other rational minds, something like that. So he admits that it's not universal in people's experiences. So it seems like there's some tension here. It's supposedly we're contacting the universe of all possibilities, but oh, by the way, some people won't be able to see it. So it doesn't sound so universal after all. So that's one comment. And another comment is, I don't know if I've ever contacted the set of all possibilities, like looking at something very simple, like an apple. I can imagine different colors, but in my experience, I can try on different colors, but I never have the experience of seeing all the possible colors at the same time. So there's a filtering, limiting factor going on that I think is maybe not well served by this idea of contacting the universe of all possibilities. So I was wondering, Christos or others, if you see a way of kind of resolving that tension.
Well, let's look at it together. Is it page 74 that the rational, or somewhere else, that where was the rational?
Well, the original definition, I think, is back on 70, isn't it? Or quite a bit earlier.
No, the original definition, yeah, it starts from from 70, but where was the rational part that was saying that it would be different for depending on the person or something like
Well, let's see here. Oh, okay. It looks like it's in 74, kind of
that?
in
That's
the
what I
middle
mean.
of the page. If I form some scientific theory or another, my complex rational activity with its rationally constituted extent belongs to the essential type that is possible, not in every possible ego, but only one that is rational in a particular sense.
Hmm.
So he's kind of implying there's presumably some non-rational people out there, or maybe people are rational, but animals aren't rational, or I don't know.
Is he
He's
know about?
limiting it.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Oh, well, he says it's rationally, let's see. Okay. Not all singly possible types are composable, da da da. And then he gives the example of forming a scientific theory with using his own complex rational activity with its rationally, it belongs to an essential type that is possible, not in, here, it belongs to an essential type that is possible, not in every possible ego, but only in one that is rational in a particular sense.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's like there's some people that that are blessed perhaps through their experience to or gifts or whatever. He doesn't go into how it is that some people or some egos have this ability to contact rationality, but others are missing. Like maybe,
But I think
yeah, go
we're talking
ahead.
about scientific theory making here.
Right, but it's so the scientific, well, this is an example though, if you're contacting something that's truly universal, wouldn't that experience, in principle at least, be available to everyone? Otherwise, in what sense is this ethos universal if not everyone can experience it
Well, it's
in that
definitely not
way?
universal aspect. The ethos itself means an aspect. And this is where he talks about the ethos, and he talks about the possibility variant of my ego. And he talks later on about the that I have varied myself to, so I reduce my de facto theorism to Zederic type. I have varied myself to, regardless of whether I'm married or not. And I think there's an eidos here, as he says, that is an all eidos, if that makes sense. So that there's the whole, but the eidos itself, I think, and perhaps other people can discuss this, I think refers to a particular aspect. For example, like a circular eidos or a compassionate eidos. So
But
it
I
may
thought
be that,
isn't eidos defined as the set of all possible variations? So circle and square and all of these come out of possibilities.
well, the all-embracing eidos, transcendental ego, yes, but not in its aspected form, right? Because we're talking a form, like a horse, right?
Olga.
Yeah, well, it's like the idea of categories coming out of the field of all possibility.
Yeah.
So one way of talking about all possibility is there's horses and non-horses. That's one way of talking about the field of all possibility. But
That's a reductive way of thinking about it, right? So the
yeah.
non-horse is nothing. It's not
Well,
something.
it's everything else. I wouldn't say it's nothing. It's actually much huger than the set of horses.
It is an analytic.
Can I suggest something, Peter? It's taking us out of the frame of Cartesian meditations, but I wonder if it would be useful if people look at the first chapter of Ideas, where eidos is analyzed and it kind of serves as a way into Husserl's understanding of eidos and its relationship with understanding or meaning or rationality. So because otherwise, he builds here on some platform and we didn't have a chance to cover this platform, and we cannot completely understand his meaning in this section without reading these preliminaries concerning this vision. So we have either to bring it into discussion or get us through at least some familiarity with the first chapter of Ideas.
Well, I'm just very briefly, and then we can move on to see if other people have things they want to talk about with these sections. I always thought that eidos meant like the look of something, aspect in the sense of the way in which the look of it strikes me as what that thing is. So it has to show itself as the kind of thing that it is. The way that Husserl talks about it in experience and judgment and probably phenomenological psychology is that you achieve the eidos by means of the free variation. So the apple example, you go through all of the different shapes and sizes, and then as you're varying this apple in front of you, you can be, as Christos was saying, through pure fantasy. At a certain point, all the variations overlay one another, and up through the variations comes the intuitable eidos, which you grasp directly. So it's like Plato saying that essences are directly intuitable. That's what Husserl is saying. And so the eidos strikes you as that which embraces all possible horses or all possible compassionate acts or all possible apples, but it is not itself the apple that you have in your hand, nor is it any one of the free variants. The essence is what, or the eidos is what you grasp directly, and the power of grasping the essence directly is that you can then see it as the look of every particular variant that is happening there. So yeah, that's what I understood him to mean. And with respect to that particular thing that Marvin was talking about, um, the the rational insight that a person can have by means of science can only be had by those people who are engaging in that scientific activity. And there are some for whom at the moment they cannot engage, whether they're animals or infants or children or people who play baseball and would rather not do science. Like all of that prevents them from having these particular eidetic insights. And the reason that that's important is because when we do phenomenology, we are required to perform the epoche and the reduction. And outside of phenomenology, we will not see the essence of human consciousness as noetic, noematic interplay, for example. That just will not show up. We will not see the transcendental ego. That just will not show us itself and will not be something we can intuit as the very eidos or essence of consciousness as such. So I think um, it's less of a problem than saying certain people are irrational, as opposed to saying, no, if you want to see this essence, you have to be capable of allowing it to manifest itself. Or another way of saying it, you have to be looking for it, but you have to be looking for it in the appropriate way. Um, that's I think all that he means in that. Um, so we have about 10 minutes. Does do Sally or Miyuki or Mohammed have anything they would like to say?
That's a very quick question.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Olga, for the suggestion, and thank you, Peter, for the explanation. So, and would you say the freely um, um, would you say that participation is something that is of the nature of the eidos, or is that something that probably or not? Yeah.
That sounds more Platonic and scholastic than Husserl, but I don't think he would deny the fact that all apples participate in the eidos of the apple. It's just that the eidos is neither in the apple nor not in the apple. So for Plato, the essences somehow subsist on their own in some realm of ideas, or the caricature of Plato is that, right? So when you're seeing the essence, you're sort of seeing something else other than the thing in front of you. Whereas for Husserl, yes, you intuit the essence directly, but they only emerge through the process of free variation. But it's just that the variants literally lay over each other. So they are layers of, and up through this thing gives itself to us on its own motor, as it were. So it is that's what makes essential intuition, which is its own kind of intuition, different than perceptual intuition, which grasps this apple here. Um, Essential intuition, perceptual intuition, and as Sally said earlier, empathy are all modes of intuition that are their own distinct modes. You cannot simply perceive an apple the way you would perceive another person, nor can you perceive another person the way that you would perceive an eidos. It's just they both have a community of structure and form and are radically distinct. They are, or at least distinct enough to be different modes of intuition for Husserl.
Thank you, very helpful.
So here's what I suggest. I suggest that I'll say a few things. I won't read, but next week, I suggest that I start by going over 34 to 38. Marvin, you do 39 to 41. I'll make some comments on that after we discuss with you what you found. And then we start the fifth meditation. I don't know that we'll get through the whole fifth meditation this summer. It might be that we go through some of it and then break until the fall and come back together and finish that and go into another work. I noticed that a number of you are really interested in psychology. We could do phenomenological psychology as a work. like, there's things we can do if you still want to be part of it and you're still interested. But before I do that, would either Miyuki or Muhammad, do you want to do a presentation on the fifth meditation?
Sure, I can do a presentation. Is it next week?
Why don't you prepare for next week, but be open to the following week if you're available both weeks? I don't know that you are, because
Yeah, yeah, no, I'll be available. The semester just ended here, so which paragraphs would that be?
would you mind doing 42, 43, and 44? That's
I
the
can do that.
first three of the fifth meditation.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask, I know that Julia wanted to do another one, so I'll ask her to do a few more. Everybody else, I know that Muhammad said he had to leave, so that I'm sad about that, but he has to go teach, so I'm assuming that his students would like him to be there. After I ask Julia, and there might be one other person who hasn't presented, is anyone else interested in doing the fifth meditation, just so that we have it in mind? Okay, so thank you, Miyuki, very much for agreeing to prepare that. I think that one of the most important things that that you mentioned, Christos, that I think we have to carry forward. I really liked your description of taste, like we're tasting something in tasting these sections. And I think that what we really need to focus on for a while is, what does Genesis mean here for Husserl? In particular, what does passive Genesis mean, and passive synthesis? Because at the heart of phenomenology is, this question of, what does constitution mean? What are we doing when we recognize objects? Are we building them? Are we creating them? Are we, in some sense, responsible for the experiences that we have? Through these next four sections, 34 to 38, I think it's really clear to me, at least, that Husserl is saying that we begin as indistinct from objects, as indistinct from world. Something is happening. He's going to call it passive synthesis. Stuff is being generated, stuff is emerging. There are beginnings that we cannot go back and claim that we did it. It's happening is about what we can say, es gibt, maybe in terms of Heidegger's language. Like, it's just happening. Out of what is happening in passive synthesis or passive genesis, we get to be active and actively bring together or collect or recognize things. But we have a prehistory with pre-givenness. And that only makes sense if we are not fully distinct from world or things. I don't think it's an accident that he brings up infancy. It's in the infant's realm of experience that the infant cannot say I, cannot think I, cannot indicate I, and yet is having experiences. And those experiences are underlying all that is happening later when they first reach for this particular thing, or even later first tell you they'd like that thing. So I want to really slow down next time and trace out what it means to begin, and in particular, what it means for the ego to begin. I am learning a lot just going through these sections again. I thought I knew, but I'm really convincing myself that, in fact, I don't know what he's talking about with passive synthesis. And it's really crucial to getting to the part in the fifth meditation where, as Sally was sort of implicitly claiming, that's where empathy happens. That's where we begin to really understand that we have the other person already within our consciousness, that we didn't make them, and we can't even make them go away. Right? So it's like that, understanding how that passive already being together works is being set up in the fourth meditation by means of this general discussion of passive synthesis and association. And so that's why I'm really happy that Christos and Marvin are helping us, because it's just not going to be possible for us to get the significance of what's going on if only I or only Christos or only Marvin, tell you what we need to do. I would just ask you for next week, please go back and reread 34 to 41. Really hone in on what you think Husserl is talking about with respect, as Christos said, to active and passive, or what it means to begin. What does it mean for something to begin? And can there ever be a beginning that doesn't have a prehistory that's holding it up, right? So those would be my thoughts. Is that okay? Does anyone want to say anything else before we break?
I would just add that my section, which leads to the fifth meditation, I found so interesting. I started reading the fifth one to see how he sets it up with some tension. So I wouldn't say it's a page turner, but for a philosophical text, it really got my interest, that section.
I'm really happy. And it seems like, Christos, you were also interested in all of this stuff too, a lot. I just have to say, I've written on this stuff a lot, and I'm realizing just how much of an idiot I am when it comes to how much, as Olga was saying, is packed into, like, all of ideas is packed into this work. All of these other things are packed in, and taking the time to separate them. I don't even know that I could speak adequately on the difference between genetic and generative phenomenology, which other people like Anthony Steinbach have talked about. Like, so much is at stake in these sections for understanding what Husserl studies has become, that I just think it would be worth slowing down. So thank you. I look forward to next week. Miyuki, if you can prepare 42 to 44, if we don't get it, if you will forgive me for not getting there so quickly, but then we'll do you the following week. All right. Thank you all very much.
so
I'm really grateful to all of you for the webinar. It's gone very well, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you all.